Welcome in, everyone, to the Fordham Sports Analytics Roundup. I am your host, Chris Orlando. Today, we are here with Seth Walder, ESPN sports analytics writer, journalist. His career path, he started as a student at Bowdoin, and then he became a New York Jets and Giants beat writer, and now he's currently working at ESPN as a sports analytics writer. Seth, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more.
Whoops, muted. My bad. Hey, how are you? I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is all true. There was, a couple, like I started covering before I covered the Jets, I covered high school sports, and did cover the Jets and the Giants, and like you said, now I'm at ESPN and part of the analytics group. Really lucky to be part of a strong, fun team here where we get to cover sports through a quantitative lens and talk about football.
Yeah, what better, honestly, and we're at a great point in the offseason. We just finished up the combine. We're approaching the draft, and we got a little bit of free agency drama. At this point, we have the Giants just recently signing Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. We have Lamar Jackson currently holding out on his contract with the Baltimore Ravens. He just got placed on the non-restrictive franchise tag, and as well as we have a little bit of Aaron Rodgers drama that might honestly happen within the next couple hours of the time of this recording. But yeah, if you want to go, before we do that, do you want to go a little bit more into your background within analytics? How did you get, you kind of started as a beat reporter, but then you moved more into your background with analytics. You want to talk a little bit more how you got into your position currently?
Yeah, sure. I was, like you said, covering the Jets and a little bit the Giants in the earlier part of the last decade. And I was really interested in the quantitative side of sports. I like cliche for people my age, had read Moneyball when I was a kid and had, read a lot of fan graphs, and I was very interested in the quantitative side, but I knew I lacked the technical skills to get a job in sports analytics. And so I remember thinking, I would love to make a shift into that. But I just am not qualified for 99% of the jobs that are available. And I did two things. I got super lucky. One of those 1-2% jobs showed up, a sports analytics writer job at ESPN, where I didn't need to build models myself. I just needed to understand what was happening and sort of convert those into sports stories. And I was very lucky because it became available. I was lucky because I got it. And I think I had worked hard to pay attention to what was happening in football analytics at the time. And that helped give me an edge. And then I was really lucky because I got to work with so many smart people at ESPN that I was able to build up some of those technical skills. Not like my colleagues. I mean, not like them. They're super sharp, but I can do things on my own on a technical way. And I'm happy about that. So, yeah.
Of course. And, the biggest thing that we preach to our club members and just like overall as the analytics space is you don't necessarily, like you mentioned, have to have those technical skills to be involved in sports analytics in any capacity. Obviously, like there are better mathematicians or better coders or better people that are better at programming languages out there. But there's always a way to follow, like you mentioned, fan graphs within baseball or just any of the analytics that are behind any sport. So, it's good that you remain involved with it. And, that the work you're doing at ESPN is all amazing. So props to you for establishing that, combination between analytics and your strength in journalism.
I appreciate that, but I sort of disagree. If your goal is to work in analytics, then you do need to get those technical skills. My path is the exception to the rule. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, and more than ever, because let's just say this: when we're looking to hire people, the technical skills are the hardest thing to find. So that's why, I get asked a lot for advice and how do I break in? And the first most important thing is build those technical skills, build your coding skills, your data science, statistics skills. That's the thing that will get you in the door and hired.
Well, there you go. Well, I mean, just to shine as you as an exception. Still really cool what you're doing over there at ESPN.
Appreciate that.
No, of course. So now we're going more into the current stage of the football season. Currently we're, as I mentioned, in NFL free agency. If you want to talk more about the, just kind of the approach that teams are making now, because there's kind of two ways that a lot like teams are constructing their roster, and it's like two very bright points. It's do I draft a quarterback, or, and then once we get to that point when we're drafting a quarterback, do we sign them to a long-term extension? A lot of these teams, they're spending a big percentage of their cap space, on the franchise quarterback. More notably, like, for example, the Giants, they could have moved on from Daniel Jones, but instead trusted his loyalty within the Giants organization and came back on, a pretty expensive, lucrative deal. Actually more expensive than the current MVP Patrick Mahomes. So if you want to go into that, like their decision, as well as maybe just like reflecting how the Ravens are handling it, and as well as like the Packers moving on from Aaron Rodgers and shifting into Jordan Love.
Okay, every situation is different, but let's talk about the Giants for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was a big error by Joe Schoen and the Giants here signing Daniel Jones to that contract. The reason I say that is because they didn't need to. So Jones is a player who's played 4 years in the NFL. 3 of them have been bad, and one of those seasons has been good. It was just last season. Mm-hmm. If I were the Giants, I would want another look at Daniel Jones too. He played well last year, very productive, they were able to make the most of his legs. But this is a guy that they didn't trust to throw more than 6 yards downfield on average. And I think I would say, okay, I want to see it again. Let's see it with more responsibility for you, and let's make you do it. The thing is, they had a lever to do that. Yeah, they had the franchise tag available. They could have signed him to one $32.4 million contract. Instead, they fully guarantee $82 million, which means that if we think about what we thought of Daniel Jones 1 year ago, when the Giants declined the 5th-year option and no one thought that was the wrong decision. And what if he goes right back to that? It's what we thought he was a year ago. I don't think that's crazy in the slightest. And if you do that, you've cost yourself $50 million in cap space. So it was unnecessary. I fear that they push this over the line. And by the way, if they franchise tag him this year and franchise tag him next year, they would still pay less. So it really didn't make any sense. So you could have gotten 2 looks honestly, it kind of boggles my mind. I fear that what they did is they thought, we want to re-sign Saquon Barkley. We're not going to get a contract done with him right now. And because he thinks he has leverage, because he thinks he's not going to get the franchise tag. And so we push this over the line with Jones, and now we can tag Barkley. Man, we're talking about a good, not elite running back who is injury prone. And again, running back, I specify one of the least valuable positions. If he had been an injury prone, good off-ball linebacker, I just don't think that they would be that would be affecting their quarterback negotiation. And yet at least it seems like it. I don't have any reporting that suggests that, but I think I'm just sort of reading the tea leaves. This is one, I think you could tell I'm fired up about it because I'm so shocked. I am so shocked that this happened.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with you. I'm not shocked that it happened in contrast, but I am, I might not have as much disagree with it, but as you know, you've covered the Giants before. I've worked a little bit with them previously. There's kind of a foundation that they've set within their organization, and it was kind of critical to them to bring back 2 guys that were fan favorites, especially in a year where they need to, where they kind of came back as a franchise into a playoff and winning contention. But I agree with you, the amount of money, if they were in a situation where they only had to keep one of them, I feel like there would have been a lot more of a flexible situation. They could have placed a franchise tag on just one of them, and then in future years they could have placed a franchise tag on another one. But since it was kind of their pressure to bring both back, it was a tough situation for them. And
they did only need to bring back one of them. They only needed to bring back Jones, and they didn't even need to. We're probably going to talk about Lamar Jackson. They would have been a pretty good candidate to try and go for Jackson. And again, I would have tagged Jones. I would want another look at him. But they did not need. There's no world where they needed to bring back Saquon Barkley unless they're letting non-football things influence them.
Yeah, no, I think that was a big part of it. Yeah, he's definitely a fan favorite there in New York, and I agree. Second contracts for running backs is not necessarily ideal for most franchises. You can always draft. There's a couple of pretty good running backs coming out of this draft class as well, and a lot of ones entering in free agency that could probably get paid for a lot less money. But yeah, I agree with you in that sense that a little bit of an overpay, but what are they going to do at this point?
A lot of it, 50 million overpay.
Yeah. Yeah, so now we're gonna move more into just how like the Baltimore Ravens are dealing with their current situation. And I've just been listening to a lot of reporters and podcasters and just people covering the Ravens, and it seems like from their perspective, they obviously want to keep Lamar there, but they kind of dealt with it as like, all right, Lamar, like we're giving you this offer, and because of the Deshaun Watson contract, we don't want to offer you a fully guaranteed $50 million annual contract. We're going to let you go in free agency, talk to other teams and see like on this non-restricted tag, what kind of money you can get. And it's kind of shown like with all the disinterest of other franchises, at least at this stage in free agency, that's kind of, the case in point. Like no one wants to pay these lucrative contracts to these quarterbacks that are going to take up the majority of their cap space. So I'm interested in hearing your opinions on like the way the Ravens are dealing with it.
Well, I think someone will. I mean, like it's too soon to say here, right? I mean, firstly, no one can even contact, no other team is even allowed to contact Lamar Jackson until next Wednesday when free agency opens. So, we don't really have a true sense. I know there's been reporting on teams being out, and maybe they are, but I think no one's going to come out and say like we're in on him right this second. That doesn't do any good for you. So he's too good to not attract interest. I think he will. I think it's like a bold move for Baltimore to put this non-exclusive tag on him in a weird way, but I think it kind of makes sense. I mean, firstly, if he ends up playing on the tag, then you still keep leverage because you can tag him again next year, where that would have probably been unpalatable if they'd gone with the exclusive franchise tag. Like you said, I think from a negotiating standpoint, it kind of lets them say, hey, here's what the market will bear for you. So like, okay, well, they have the right to match it. And remember that he's not a true free agent. It's what the market will bear for him for teams that are also going to have to give up 2 first-round picks. So it's not like it's a true free market. And again, they retain that right where they can, maybe they say we don't want to guarantee him, I don't know, $200 million, but maybe push comes to shove, another team offers them that, and they say, fine, okay, we do it, or not, and they lose 2 picks, but I don't know, it depends a lot, or they gain 2 picks, but it gives themselves options. They have a lot of control right now. They still right now, he's set to play for them for that franchise tag. So I don't have a great answer as to like what will happen. I don't think anybody knows what will happen. I'm certainly curious. It's been interesting seeing all these teams, the reporting come out saying these teams are not interested. I do tend to think that some teams will be interested.
No, and I agree. Like when you have a player of the caliber in Lamar Jackson, I agree. Like a lot of teams are going to be interested, and it's just a matter of like obviously the money on the table and like what he wants in comparison to some of the other deals that have been on the table for other quarterbacks. So obviously that market's pretty high after the Deshaun Watson deal, but it seems like they're kind of holding back, even though the talent of a former MVP.
And what if it goes long? Like, I don't know. Maybe this will be a quick process, but maybe it's not. What if it's a team that misses out on the top 4 QBs in the draft, right? They kind of want to go QB in the draft, but they don't get one. and then maybe then they say, okay, maybe we do this now.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's a big domino effect. You want to see like how, where Rodgers goes and like, how the quarterback, like you mentioned, how the quarterbacks in the draft go and some of those other guys like like the Commanders, while they said like they're interested in, moving on with Sam Howell, like they wouldn't that necessarily be opposed to having a guy like Lamar Jackson, especially if they can get him on a cheaper deal in comparison to other quarterbacks. But it'll be interesting to see how they approach with the former MVP. But now let's shift more into from one former MVP to another former MVP. Aaron Rodgers is in current talks with the New York Jets about a trade that would kind of transpire. I'm curious just hearing your opinions on, as someone who used to cover the Jets, like how much of an impact would be on their organization to get a real franchise quarterback, even though he's kind of getting up there in age but still has like the elite quarterback abilities that he's as displayed as the MVP last year.
MVP, yeah, 2 years ago.
2 years
Last year
ago.
it wasn't very good.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's such an interesting spot. It's like there's a lot of there are drawbacks, there are big risks here for the Jets, but I would do it because it's like for both Rodgers and the Jets, I think that there's like major risks, but it's still the most logical move. The Jets do have a bit of a window here with this roster, I do think, and that just doesn't last for very long when you have a good young roster. You put Aaron Rodgers on the team and they're a real contender. And there's no other way that they can do that. They're not a real contender without him without Rodgers or maybe, Lamar Jackson too. So I think it's kind of fascinating. Yeah, I do think I'll be curious to see how the negotiation goes. It seems like the Jets, as so tough saying being on a podcast in this kind of moment because it's like I could say something by the time this is out there.
Yeah.
Things could have changed, but at this moment, it sort of seems like the Jets are the only suitor and Rodgers. But at the same time, like Rodgers is the only potential match. So I'll be curious to see how the negotiation goes with the Packers, and I think it's a risk worth taking, but it's certainly a risk.
No, for sure. And, obviously, as I mentioned, like back-to-back MVP, even up there in age, that kind of would have put them ahead of most teams, at least at this point. And especially you have both rookies of the years and Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner, as well as, potential other rookie of the year in Breece Hall. Like that offense would be quite dynamic. And Elijah Moore, we've seen glimpses of him be an elite prospect for them, but obviously he had some frustrations last season with kind of the way the offense ran. So they definitely have some pieces there, both on the offense and the defensive side. And I'm interested to see how they approach it with the draft, and especially getting a guy like him could definitely complete their roster.
We think so. I mean, like, again, I do think it's important. Like, it's like we talk about the back-to-back MVPs, and this is a player that was not very good last year and is 39 years old.
Mhm.
And I'm the first one to say, like, hey, let's not just look at last season when we're talking about players, but we got to remember that he didn't play well. Like I don't think it's within the range of outcomes that Aaron Rodgers has played his last good season as a player, and that's part of the risk here. But I agree with you, like. There's enough upside that it's worth it.
Yeah, I agree. And especially because they are in a position, but a lot of the top quarterbacks in this draft, at least, are sitting, out of their pick range. They're at pick 13. So it would be difficult for them to trade up unless they would obviously have to give up some future assets. And with the direction that seems like the roster is going, it's sort of a win now because you don't have to pay guys like Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, or Breece Hall until obviously in the future. So obviously it's difficult with the cap space, but with their current roster, like the kind of talent that they have, it's definitely a fitting situation. But as you mentioned, we don't even know if Aaron Rodgers is going to play at the same level he did 2 years ago. But it also, to mention, there's a lot more talent on this roster, at least this offense, as compared to last year. losing a guy like Devontae Adams is pretty difficult for him. But a guy like
Mhm.
Garrett Wilson and another guy like Elijah Moore, and obviously they just released Braxton Berrios, but they still have Corey Davis and some other pieces on that offense that could definitely be an upgrade from what they had in Lambeau, and especially partnering with Nathaniel Hackett, who didn't have necessarily a good season last season with the Broncos, but he's had experience working with working at the Packers with him. So
Mhm.
interested to see how that situation shifts. And obviously we're recording this podcast here on Thursday, March 9th. This could potentially at 12 p.m. This could potentially be changed within the next couple hours. But yeah, so now as we took a little glimpse of the draft, I'm interested in hearing, like, obviously we saw guys like Anthony Richardson and CJ Stroud kind of dominate the combine, and we're not into the pro day schedule yet, but moving towards it, it's looking like there's going to be at least 4 quarterbacks taken within the top 10. I'm interested in seeing like how some of these teams are approaching moving up, because there's a lot of teams that need a quarterback or could potentially have an upgraded quarterback, but they, there's obviously some teams in the top 5, like the Cardinals, like the Bears, that, could potentially trade back to fit more needs on their roster. I'm interested in see how like your I guess perspective of the way that the current draft landscape is.
Yeah. So, I mean, like for me, I don't start paying like super close attention to the draft until post free agency, but I agree with like the general themes of what you're talking about is what I'm interested in. How do the quarterbacks go? Which teams are going to move up? 2 teams like Detroit and Seattle, I feel like are not talked about as QB teams, but like totally could be sitting there in the top 10. And especially if one of them does jump in, you think obviously Houston's going to take a quarterback and Indy's going to take a quarterback. And then we certainly look at needs for Atlanta, Las Vegas, Carolina. So someone is getting left out. Now, maybe it ends up looking like sort of straightforward, and like the Raiders sign Garoppolo, and then Detroit and Seattle decide not to get involved, and and then you've got sort of like longer shots like Washington. Could they jump up and get in the mix? I mean, totally could. I think that's kind of everything, is who decides to make those moves, and it'll be that part will certainly be interesting.
For sure. And again, as you mentioned, Washington, those top 4 teams in Carolina, the Colts, the Texans, the Raiders, all need quarterback. And there's quarterbacks out there, as you mentioned. Garoppolo is still out there. Lamar's still out there. Rodgers is out there. So there's a lot of pieces still need to be filled within these rosters. And while I don't want to primarily talk about quarterbacks this entire time, it kind of seems like that's the way the dominoes are going to fall, like within the rest of free agency. You kind of want to build your franchise around, like, are we going to pay a running back a lot of money? Are we going to pay a defensive pass rusher? Or, there's some guys out there, while, like Jesse Bates is still a pretty big name out there in free agency. Like it's kind of determined on how the direction of the franchise is going. And that's kind of predetermined by the quarterback. So it'll be interesting to see, with the draft approaching, especially with some of the, big days from the combine. But yeah, so now after talking about the draft, I kind of want to go more into like we are a sports analytics club here at Fordham. And I'm kind of interested in hearing your background with it. Obviously you mentioned that you're more of a writer, but you have that background in analytics. I'm curious to see, like, within some of the stuff you're putting on Twitter, some of the stuff you're working on at ESPN, what kind of projects are you working on with, especially since the NFL season is over with? Like, what projects are you working on as the season is approaching next year, and just as the draft and free agency is, in the mix right now?
Yeah. So in terms of projects, I mean, a lot of it, I don't have any, like, I would say crazy new metrics or something like that I'm working on. A lot of it is simply covering the league. So like, first and foremost, in some ways, my job is to write about sports, write about football using quantitative analysis. So like right now, I mean, football's not happening, but we have major shifts in major offseason moves are about to happen in free agency. And so like my job for the next couple of weeks is going to be evaluating those moves through a quantitative lens, which is how I approach things. And so when people are signing players in free agency or making trades, like, yeah, it's my job to make those evaluations. One of the benefits of having access to the player tracking data that we have through NFL Next Gen Stats is that we've created a slew of player-based metrics that we didn't have before, and the NFL's group has done a great job making their own metrics as well. So putting those two things together, we have a lot of information on players, from corners to tackles to edge rushers. And so what I mainly do is try and look at the league through the lens of those stats.
No, it's all really cool stuff that you're doing there. And Next Gen Stats has been a very valuable resource to anybody looking into the analytics space, especially through that play-by-play tracking data. As I'm sure everyone has seen on Twitter, those kind of, those
the
graphics.
dots?
Yeah, the graphics, those are honestly the coolest things ever. Like, I love just seeing, like, because obviously you watch it on film, or you watch it, the highlights on Instagram or whatever social media, but you can't necessarily see what's going on each play, like what I guess the background of it. And you kind of see the X's and O's in action, and that stuff is just so cool. And while it's more of like a qualitative data analysis and that, or more just data visualization in that, it definitely adds some sort of like some landscape to saying, like, oh, right, so like what happened on this play, like what more can I look into, like why this happened, and like what kind of scheme we're running on both offense and defense. So it's definitely interesting to see like the trajectory that Next Gen Stats is having in the analytics space.
Absolutely. All credit to the NFL's folks for those dots animations, because they did a really nice job with them. They're so smooth and they look nice, and you can really, you can glean a lot of information from them. I do love them.
Yeah. So going more into that, how are you using that, like those Next Gen Stats in specifically to better advance your analysis at ESPN?
So we've created these metrics for, let me give an example. So a few years ago, we created Brian Burke, my data scientist on our team, sort of godfather of football analytics. He created these win rate metrics that we use to evaluate players in the trenches. So we have a metric called pass block win rate. And the idea is that we're measuring how often an offensive lineman sustains their block for at least 2.5 seconds. And so we're able to do that with the player tracking data, because essentially it's saying, like, right, so there's chips in every player's shoulder pads, tracks each player's location every 10th of a second, and which direction they're facing, how fast they're moving. So we're sort of saying, like, if you and I are facing each other and we're super close and I'm the offensive lineman, the quarterback's behind me, like, okay, yeah, I'm blocking you. And so the key is, do you get past me within 2.5 seconds? And that is, the time element's really important there, because every offensive lineman gets beat eventually. It's just how fast. And so that's why we make that threshold. It's been super valuable because it's allowed us to evaluate these players in a way that we couldn't with our eyes, and for, to the untrained eye, and certainly be able to look at just so many plays. Like, think about how many player plays there are. And so we can do all of that almost instantly, and then have that for the entire season, and be able to compare players. It's really useful. So when we think about, like, in free agency, it really gives us a lens into the quality of players' performance. And so, like, let's take a pass block win rate example. I think Jawan Taylor is the Jaguars right tackle who's going to get paid this offseason. He's a pretty good pass blocking tackle. I think he's a little overrated because Trevor Lawrence is so good at sack avoidance. But we have him as, like, maybe average, maybe slightly above average in terms of pass protection. The thing is like, what I find really interesting, and I think that he's probably attractive to teams because he's in the prime of his career, relatively high draft picks. So there's probably some upside there. But I certainly look at the other right tackles out there, and I think there's a bunch of journeymen who are almost as capable and probably will get paid a lot less, like Cameron Fleming, Andrew Wiley, Jermaine Illuminor. Kelvin Beachum plays on the left side and is definitely on the decline now, I think, but still, like, there's a lot of guys that I think, at least the metrics are saying, are basically in the same ballpark when it comes to pass protection as Jawan Taylor. And that's a really hard thing to do without numbers. I mean, certainly I think that scouts are impressive in their ability to do that, but I think it's just a really tricky thing without having metrics, or at least the way I think about things. So, like, when we rolled those out, I think in 2018, I mean, since then it completely changed the way that I cover football, because I started paying so much more attention to what was happening on the offensive line and the pass rush, the defensive line. And it's given them, certainly for me, I think for lots of folks across ESPN, I hope, like another huge tool in the way that we talk about football.
And I completely agree with that, with your statement on, the example used with Jawan Taylor. You don't necessarily see in the exact metrics that, he obviously has his good pass block win rates, or, just as like as a fraction of, what Trevor Lawrence has done. But Trevor Lawrence has also done, a lot in, as you mentioned, like pass rush avoidance, scrambling, getting out of the pocket, and the data visualization that adds more of a qualitative aspect of it. Sometimes that the numbers can't evaluate. But I agree with you. Like, maybe Jawan Taylor might get a lot of money in free agency because he's a young, a rising star, but potentially, like, he still has some potential to grow. But I agree with you. Like, those metrics can kind of evaluate, saying, like, at this current point, are we paying him similar value, as to someone who's going to do this basically the same thing? Are we banking on him, being a better, tackle within the future? There's a lot of moving parts within that. And I agree with you. Like, the data gives you at least a great, just groundwork and starter to seeing that.
Yeah, it's been really fun. So, and we have a bunch, like, I think that's maybe the best example, but I think I like to think that we've got a lot of other stats that can help aid in the evaluation of other players. I mean, like, the NFL's group created rush yards over expectation. It was the product of a really impressive big data bowl back in 2020, big data bowl entry back in 2020. And, that really changes the way that we look at running backs. We've created new receiver tracking metrics, which evaluate the receiver's ability to say get open on a play-to-play level, whether or not they're targeted, not just their separation, but consider leverage and that kind of thing. And, like, that's just for quarterback. And that's the kind of thing that helps us look at a player like Garrett Wilson or a player like Chris Olave, who have one season in the league and played with a bad quarterback. And the metrics say, like, hey, these guys are, and both have like 1,000-ish yards, which is like good for a rookie. And those metrics are saying, like, no, Chris Olave is a top 10 wide receiver right now. Mm-hmm. And it just may not look like it because he's playing with Andy Dalton, but like, in terms of how he performed this season on a per route basis, that's what he is.
Yeah, I could obviously Olave had such a good season with the Saints, and Garrett Wilson had a great season with that. But it's also those stats kind of put him into better perspective. While the numbers might necessarily be, the box score stats might not necessarily be there, those guys dominated at a professional level in their rookie seasons, and it's really cool to see, like, their progression. And, the stats definitely support it at this young point in their career.
Those stats are publicly available. Folks, if folks don't know what I'm talking about, you can go check them out. We put them on 538. And so we break down receivers' ability to get open, make the catch, and generate yak, all relative to expectations. And so we see, like, Deontay Johnson is a great example of a player that we gave a 99 open score to. So evaluating every one of his routes, it's indicating that this is a player that gets open quite a lot. And it's indicating that Kenny Pickett didn't give him the ball. He didn't make he didn't do like an awesome job about creating catch or generating yak or making the catch or creating yak relative to expectation. But like in terms of getting open, which is the most important of the three categories, the most stable year to year, Johnson is really good. And so I think there's a lot of ways that's useful. Like first and foremost, I'm going to be drafting Deontay Johnson in fantasy next
Oh,
year.
so will I. Yeah, no, he gets too many targets, and he's too good of a receiver to not be
Yeah.
appreciated enough. I agree with you on that. Yeah, he's definitely an elite prospect, especially, at this young point in his career. But before we wrap up, obviously the recording is winding down. I'm curious to hear your advice to anybody getting into the sports or analytics field. We are a sports analytics club, as I mentioned. Obviously you're more on the journalism side, but just interested in hearing how people can advance their skills and get more into the space.
Code. Learn R, Python, and if you've never started, it's totally doable. I didn't code at all until I was like 30, and I promise it's doable. NFL Fast R has an excellent beginner's guide for anyone who has not ever, if you've never coded a minute in your life. That's a great guide, gets you set up like right from the very beginning. You don't need to know that much to do something. I think that's one of the cool things that I felt. So you can like totally doable even if you've never coded anything at all. But like that is the first step. It is a prereq.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. We preach that to all of our club members to get started through there. Well, Seth, thank you so much for coming on to the Fordham Sports Analytics Roundup. We'll have this recording up within the next couple of days, and just want to thank you again for your time. And hopefully we'll see the rest of these dominoes fall within free agency and the draft.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you again.